Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. And we are continuing with the Doldrums. And we are on chapter 5. So let's get to it. Ready? All right. Hold on and let's go. Chapter 5. That evening, 15 minutes prematurely, the doorbell rang. Mr. Helmsley was upstairs, trying to remove cologne he'd been heavy-handed in applying, and Archer was sitting at the table, half watching as Mrs. Helmsley moved frantically about the kitchen. He had offered to help, but his mother wanted everything perfect, so Archer sat quietly in his bow tie, keeping himself busy with his grandfather's journal, which he held just out of sight. In the journal it read, "The train was green, a brilliant green. There were no seats inside. We climbed and sat atop the roof. A fine choice that was. The twisting mountains were incredible." When the doorbell rang, Mrs. Helmsley was in the middle of slicing a roasted lamb and sent Archer to welcome the Merkleys. "And remember what I told you," she said. The knife in her hand made her look very serious. "Be sure to say thank you, and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and don't forget to introduce yourself. My name is Archer." Archer inched his way down the hall. The sitting-room canary grew silent. He reached for the knob, but before he could even touch it, the door flew open and in tramped Mrs. Merkley, followed shortly by Henry. Archer was speechless and, if only for a brief second, thoughtless. He stared at Mrs. Merkley, and Mrs. Merkley stared back at him. Seeing Mrs. Merkley from a balcony or a tree was one thing. From this angle, her figure bore a striking resemblance to a hot air balloon. He made an educated guess, however, that this lady would never float so gracefully off ground. Finally, Mrs. Merkley broke the silence. "Young man," she snorted, "my coat. You should offer to take my coat." Archer tried to say something, but he was rattled and nothing came out. Any word would have been better than nothing, but nothing was all he had. Then his mother's instructions flashed through his head. "Thank you," he said. "Why are you thanking me?" she snipped. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Yes, what?" "No, ma'am." "What's wrong with you?" "My name is Archer," said Archer. It was a terrible thing to see Archer go to pieces like this, but there was something in Mrs. Merkley's gaze that simply undid him. Mrs. Merkley turned that gaze to Henry. "I'm going to drop my coat on it," she whispered. "Keep your distance, and don't let it touch you." Archer stuck out his arms. Mrs. Merkley dropped her coat and proceeded to the dining room. Henry followed close behind. Mr. Helmsley hurried down the stairs while tucking in his shirt and nodded at Archer. "A fur coat," he whispered as he passed by. "What kind of person wears fur in the summer?" Archer had a few guesses, but his knees were about to give out. He quickly reached for one of the 2 caribous that the Helmsley used as coat racks. "Not mine," cried the first. "Use his. My antlers can't support that kind of weight." Archer turned to the second caribou. "That's absolute rubbish," it replied. "His antlers are much stronger than mine." "I'm sorry, but I have to," Archer said, hooking the coat on the first. No sooner did he let go than the antler point snapped, dropping the coat in a heap on the floor. "Look what you've done," the caribou cried. Archer picked up the antler point and tucked it into his pocket, promising to fix it after dinner. He left the coat where it was and quickly made for the dining room. Of all the rooms in Helmsley House, the dining room was truly something special. Circling the table were animals from all 4 corners of the world. A zebra, peacock, and antelope stood among many others. Archer took his usual spot in front of the antelope. Mrs. Merkley was directed to the seat next to him. Lovely. During dinner, Archer paid little attention to the conversation. Even if he had been interested, he knew his opinion wouldn't matter. All that concerned him was keeping his mouth shut and his best foot forward. He chased a pea around the plate with his fork. And there they are all at dinner. Mrs. Merkley's eyes took a turn about the room as she hacked away at her lamb. What did you say you do for a living?" she asked Mr. Helmsley. "Perfume sales, was it?" "I'm a lawyer," Mr. Helmsley replied. "But if you're wondering about the house, it's my parents' doing. Ralph and Rachel Helmsley. They were explorers. Perhaps you've heard of them." Mrs. Merkley had never heard of them, and she was glad, because she had no interest in people who gallivant the world aimlessly. After saying this, she continued staring at the animals. They certainly are a little, out there, she said. I could never share a house with such people. They don't live here any more, said Mrs. Helmsley. There was an iceberg incident, said Mr. Helmsley. Mrs. Merkley nodded. That's pretty far out there, she said. But what can one expect from people who make such bizarre career choices? Archer pressed his pea, chasing fork hard against his plate. It made a terrible, unpleasant screech. Mrs. Merkley glared at him. Are you having utensil troubles, Alfred? She asked. My name is Archer, said Archer. And he wasn't having utensil problems. He was having a brash, bemouthing, insulting his grandparents problem. Are you sure? Mrs. Merkley insisted. Because you've been trying to secure that pea for quite some time now. Or perhaps it's distaste for the vegetable that drives your fork to wander. Either way, end this wild goose chase and eat that pea. Arthur didn't mind eating peas, but doing something because you wish to is different from doing something because you're told to. Still, he could feel his mother eyeing him from across the table, and he knew what he had to do. Archer begrudgingly swallowed the pea, and Mrs. Merkley turned back to the adults and smiled. It's a gift, she chirped. One that I discovered when I was still quite little. When I instruct people, listen. I see what's wrong, and I fix it. Take this room, for example, she said, using her fork as a pointer. I know someone who can fix this terrible mess that Ralph and Rachel have left you with. She's the one who needs fixing, thought Archer. Mr. Helmsley smiled. There does seem to be something off about it, he said. I just haven't been able to put my finger on it. Mrs. Helmsley nudged him. That's just it, Mrs. Merkley squealed. And this is precisely why I teach children. Now you mustn't take this personally, Richard, but old minds are far too rusty and corroded to change their ways. Young minds, on the other hand, are ripe for adjustment. The modus operandi is really not so different from that of a mechanic. One simply sticks a wrench into their little ear and twists the bolts till you have them running smoothly. Metaphorically speaking, of course, she quickly added. She's not sticking that wrench in my ear, thought Archer. I don't think it's too much to assume, Mrs. Merkley continued, that things could have been much different for Ralph and Rachel had they known someone like me when they were little. Yes, I could have set them straight, just like young Alfred here. That certainly would have been interesting, Mr. Helmsley replied. Archer didn't find this interesting in the least. Who did this balloon think she was to come into Helmsley House and insult the very people who created it? No, she couldn't have changed his grandparents, and she wouldn't control him. As the adults continued the conversation, Archer put his best foot under the chair and began slipping his peas one by one into his hand. And what made you decide to leave Ravenwood? Mr. Helmsley asked. Mrs. Merkley took a gulp of wine. You know how it is with these schools, she said, always changing personnel. Sometimes I feel like a missionary of old going from one jungle to the next. When Archer had gathered a generous amount of peas, he discreetly reached back to discard them into the antelope's mouth. I don't want those either, said the antelope. But you're a herbivore, whispered Archer. Even we herbivores have our limits. Despite its protest, the antelope soon found Archer's hand inserted into his mouth. But just as Archer was about to make the deposit, a shadow from the east fell upon him. And what's this? Demanded Mrs. Merkley. A pea shot from her mouth and landed safely in Henry's eye. Archer froze. Remove that hand, she persisted, but Archer kept it where it was. The air congealed. Henry retrieved the pea so he could see what was happening. Archer Helmsley, remove that hand at once, Mrs. Helmsley demanded. Archer instantly regretted putting himself in this position. Everyone was staring at him, but he mostly looked at his mother. She wasn't going to like this, not one bit. He slowly removed his hand. The antelope gave a sigh of relief. Mrs. Merkley grabbed his wrists. Peas bounced in all directions. Henry's eyes caught a second one. Just as I thought, Mrs. Merkley announced. It would appear, Helena, that your son has been using this late gazelle's mouth as a hiding spot for his unwanted vegetables. It's not a gazelle, said Archer, pulling his wrist free. It's an antelope. Yes, agreed Henry. If you'll know how the antlers... I don't care what kind of animal it is, Mrs. Merkley bellowed. I do know it's not a trash can. Archer cringed as his mother tried her best to retrieve the wayward peas, This was going to ruin everything if he didn't find a way to quickly make up for it. "I apologize to you both," Mrs. Helmsley said. "This is not the sort of behavior we expect from him." "I should hope not," said Mrs. Merkley, plopping a potato into her mouth. "I will not tolerate such behavior from my students at the academy, and I warn you both right now, should Alfred keep this up, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in prison." "Prison," said Henry. "Prison," Mr. Helmsley smiled. "Yes, prison," said Mrs. Merkley. "I'm already in prison," thought Archer. "I'll bet if you asked around," said Mrs. Merkley, "you would find that many criminals began their slippery slope into a life of crime by stuffing their unwanted vegetables into the mouths of animals." "Into her mouth, more like it," whispered the antelope. Archer smiled, but that was another mistake. Mrs. Merkley caught sight of this and thought he was smiling at her. Mrs. Merkley was not the sort of woman you smile at. A tiny vein on her temple doubled in size, and her face turned as red as the wine in her glass. "Go right ahead and laugh, young man," she snapped, throwing her napkin on the table. "By all means, everyone laugh. Just don't expect an ounce of sympathy from me when the police pound at your door and sentence him to the electric chair as punishment for his life of crime." Archer looked at his father. "Why don't you go on upstairs?" Mr. Helmsley said. "We'll discuss this later." "We certainly will," said Mrs. Helmsley, who in that moment looked more frightening than Mrs. Merkley. Without protest, Archer stood up and did as he was told, avoiding eye contact with his mother as he made for the door. Just before leaving, he turned back to Mrs. Merkley, planning to apologize, but Mrs. Merkley cut him off. "You watch it, young man," she said, "or you just might find yourself atop an iceberg someday." It's often said that heat rises, and it must be true because Archer was feeling hot under the collar when he reached the top of the stairs. It's not difficult to see why. If some brash behemoth marched into your house and told your parents that one day you'd be sitting cozy in an electric chair, you might be tempted to lower an eyebrow or two. But that wasn't it. It was the comments about his grandparents being crazy that set Archer boiling. Did Ralph and Rachel march to the beat of a different drum? Perhaps. You could even say they ditched the marching and the drums and danced a jig to a xylophone instead. But crazy? Certainly not. Ralph and Rachel wore fur in the summer. Archer ripped off his bow tie and tossed it to the floor. He trudged down the hallway to his bedroom, knowing tomorrow would not bring something new. Tomorrow would bring something worse, and he now wanted nothing more than to drive that beastly woman out of Helmsley House. "Be on the lookout," he said to the polar bear in the alcove. "If what they say about heat rising is true, there's a hot air balloon that's sure to come this way, and she'll look at you as if you're the bizarre museum creature." "But I am the bizarre museum creature," the polar bear replied. "You're more real than she is." No sooner did Archer say these words than he was struck with a brilliant idea. A smile stretched across his face, and he turned back to the polar bear. "You're much bigger than a non-nocturnal opossum," he said. "Please don't drag me into this," the bear replied. And that's precisely what Archer did. With all his might, he dragged the bear down the hallway and into his bedroom. Archer would have his revenge. Archer was no stranger to Helmsley House dinner parties, and he knew that almost anyone who ever attended one would request a tour of the house. These tours always concluded near his bedroom on the top floor. That's what he was hoping for, and sure enough, no more than an hour later, voices were heard ascending the stairs. "And this, Henry, is our—" Mr. Helmsley stopped. "Where's the polar bear?" Mrs. Helmsley shook her head. "What polar bear?" she asked. "There was a polar bear here." "I never noticed a polar bear." Henry nodded. "Polar bears are like that sometimes." "Enough with the polar bears," Mrs. Merkley demanded. "If it found these living arrangements half as disturbing as I do, it's likely that creature took the first bus out of here. Now, please, I've seen far more than I care to see, and it's time we returned home." Mrs. Merkley marched back to the stairs, but Mrs. Helmsley stopped her retreat. She had only dragged Mrs. Merkley along because she wanted Archer to apologize for his behavior in the dining room and for leaving her coat in a heap on the floor. Mrs. Merkley sighed and made the universal gesture for "let's get on with it." Then she pushed her way to the front of the group and pointed to a door. Mrs. Helmsley nodded. "Right," huffed Mrs. Merkley, and she threw it open. "Revenge is a dish best served cold, but you mustn't go too cold. Archer went too cold. After waiting an hour, Archer had fallen asleep. What's worse, he had fallen asleep in the very trap he'd set for Mrs. Merkley. That is to say, he fell asleep with his head inside the gaping jaws of the retired polar bear. His body dropped on a chair. When Mrs. Merkley threw open the door, it collided with the wall, jolting Archer from his dream and into a situation he didn't remember. He saw teeth, he felt fur, and he panicked. Archer shouted. The glass eye fell from the bear's mouth and rolled across the floor. It bounced off Mrs. Merkley's shoe and looked up at her. Mrs. Merkley's shriek was of such a pitch and volume that it would have buried them all beneath an avalanche had they been living in the Himalayas. Henry fell backward down the stairs. Mr. Helmsley failed to grab him. Mrs. Helmsley was a blank slate, likely saving her expression for later. Archer braced, thinking the walls were about to implode. Fortunately, Mrs. Merkley imploded first. Archer stood on the front steps watching as the paramedics carried Mrs. Merkley out of the house on a stretcher. He was still foggy as to what had just happened. "A criminal," she mumbled as she passed. "That's what you are. That's what you've raised." "I can't apologize to you enough for this dinner," his mother said. "No need for that," said Henry, hoisting himself into the back of the ambulance. He tapped at his chest where presumably a heart was located. "Bad ticker," he said. "She's had a bad one ever since she was little. Nothing to worry about." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "She's a little dramatic, don't you think?" "Stand clear," said a paramedic as he slammed the doors. "Stand clear." With sirens blaring, the ambulance sped off down the Willow Street bound for Rosewood Hospital. Whatever remaining hope Archer had of seeing anything but the inside of Helmsley House that summer was also rushed off to the hospital. Unlike Mrs. Merkley, such hope would not survive the night. Archer stuck his hands in his blazer pockets. "I'm sorry," he said. "I fell asleep." "And it's time you wake up," Mrs. Helmsley demanded. "You're buttering your grip on reality." "I guess the best foot was the right one," Mr. Helmsley mumbled. "Well, nowhere to go except up. I suppose there's always sideways, but I think up would be preferable. Regardless, I think we'll agree that she was a little, out there." "That's no excuse." Archer could feel the heat pouring off his mother. He'd seen her angry before, but not like this. You could probably fry an egg on her head, but now wasn't a good time to attempt such a thing. Archer had wanted to drive Mrs. Merkley out of Helmsley House. He didn't intend to do so in an ambulance. But that's what had happened, and after he followed his parents back inside, the swift arm of justice fell, and it fell hard. That's the end of chapter 5. What's going to happen, poor Archer? All right, we'll have to see until tomorrow. All right, have a good day.